During the 1950s and 1960s, there was an upheaval in southern states like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. African Americans held marches, stand-ins, and boycotts to try to make a difference in racial equality in the United States. Up to this point, blacks in the U.S. were discriminated by segregation on buses, water fountains, in restaurants, schools, shops, restrooms, jobs, and waiting rooms. These were called Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws weren't actual laws. Instead, they were standards set by whites. These standards also include no intermarriage and no voting, even if by law they were able to. This was because they were made to take literacy tests or were harassed for trying to vote. There were groups that heavily affected the movement positively and negatively. Many of these have left an imprint in history. Those most famously recognized include the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, in which African Americans refused to ride city buses to protest segregated seating. 4 days before the boycott began, Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat to a white man on a Montgomery bus. She was arrested and fined. The boycott began on the day of her hearing and lasted 381 days. Martin Luther King Jr. emerged as a prominent leader in the wake of the action. Dr. King's most famous action was the I Have a Dream speech. It was delivered August 28, 1963 at the Lincoln Memorial. Brown v. Board of Education was a more local event that took place in Topeka in 1954. This led to a new law that started school integration throughout the United States. In 1962, James Meredith, an African American, attended his first day of college at the University of Mississippi. This set off riots which resulted in the deaths of 2 students. The infamous Freedom March from Selma to Montgomery occurred in 1965 and helped raise awareness for African American voters. This 50-mile march included such prominent leaders as Martin Luther King Jr., James Bevel, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Later in the year, a Voting Rights Act was passed. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. This ended segregation in all public places around the country and banned employment discrimination. It is considered one of the most crowning achievements of the Civil Rights Movement. Despite what was happening in the South, it was a lot different than what was happening in Kansas. There was a town in the western part of Kansas called Nicodemus. Nicodemus was an all-black community that was settled by exodusters that immigrated from Kentucky and Tennessee. There were 30 people that first settled there in July of 1877. 2 more groups followed, making the total population of Nicodemus around 700 people by 1880. Many of these people were able to secure land. The land almost always stayed within the family. While tending to their farms, blacks invented new farming methods. However, many did not get credit because of race. Nada McWilliams was one of those people that lived around the Nicodemus area. Nada was born in 1931 on a farm in Logan County. She went to an all-black school for 2 years, but a majority was spent in a mixed class in a one-room schoolhouse. There were not enough people to afford to have segregated schools. Therefore, blacks and whites were combined. For 3 years, she had to stay with her aunt and uncle just to go to high school, because it was in a different town. Colored students oftentimes had to take a different route to school because white people didn't want them walking on the roads by their property.
Kids and education, just grade school education it was. They would have to go around about 2 miles farther to their school. Went too close to these people's house, made them mad for because kids were getting education and they'd sick the dogs on them.
Nada grew up during the Dust Bowl when things were very different. For example, a full plate of food could be purchased for $1, and a slice of cake and a bowl of ice cream was a nickel. Also, relationships between whites and blacks were very different. There were prejudices against both races. For instance, Nada told us that their teacher was black and she was very prejudiced against whites. At times, prejudices only came when it was convenient or gained favor for the whites. For example, area schools, despite his race, recruited Nada's cousin that was really good at baseball.
On farther down the line, I had some cousins that were much younger than me, George and Arthur Jr. White was their name. And so they were real good ball players. And so, of course, you know how they like ball, how they asked their dad about, oh, why don't you move? Why don't you move to Winona? If you move, we'd find you a house. We'd find you a house. So it'd be handy for the boys to be there because they were just crazy about those colored guys, my cousins, you know, playing ball.
Although discrimination wasn't as prominent in Kansas as in the South, she still shared some experiences of racism. For example, she said that she was really good at yodeling, but no one ever asked her to perform because of her race. Restaurants in Kansas didn't publicly say that blacks weren't allowed, but Nada and others during that time would just avoid certain places if they were suspicious that they might not be welcome for fear they might be turned down.
There was a place that I was kind of suspicious about. They didn't want me. I just wouldn't, I would go there. I just wouldn't go there.
In Seneca during that time, there was only one restaurant that would serve blacks, but they had to be in a back room away from white patrons.
My dad told me this story when I was a little kid. He never told me the name of the town. But he said when he moved to Kansas from California in 1949, he lived out near Frankfort out there where there was a huge black community, mostly his family, a few, like 3 or 4 other black families. If you look at Frankfort's history, they've always had from Vermilion all the way over, and most of them were related to my dad. When he moved to his aunt's place, and they farmed 1,000 acres just south of Frankfort, past the S-curve there on the Highway 99. But he played on a local baseball team, a city baseball team, and they traveled. They had gone to another town to play baseball, and on the way back home to Frankfort, they stopped in a town to get something to eat, and he stayed in the car because he was pretty certain they weren't going to serve him.
Really?
Well, when I went to my 25th year high school graduation, I met the other guy that stayed in the car with him. And this guy, he was an old guy, I don't know, I guess he was somewhere around, but he cried and gave me a hug, and because my dad had passed at this time, and he said, I for years was going to come and talk to your dad and tell him, I think that he thought that I stayed in the car to some, but the reason I stayed in the car is because I didn't have any money. And he didn't have the heart to tell my, well, when that guy told me the exact same story, he filled in the names of the towns. They played on Hiawatha, and they stopped to eat in Seneca.
Ada told us that when her relatives visited the South, there were colored entrances, but they never used them and just went in the white doors. Much of what was happening in the South wasn't broadcast to the Midwest because people in charge didn't want an uprising in the black community. When Nada graduated in 1949, she went to Topeka for a couple years and got a job. Getting a job for blacks was harder than it was for whites during that time.
Back in those days, you'd kind of think before you made a move, because if there was just like I told my daughter now, who's in Fredonia, I said, like if you come back to Seneca, and there'd be, say, like one job open at a store or something like that, and a white person, and you would be there, you'd about know who'd get the job, wouldn't you?
Nada still managed to find work at a hospital while there. Whites could only hold political positions, even though blacks were more than capable of holding these positions. Although racism is still in the world, it's not just African Americans. There are prejudices against all races all over the world. We can learn from the past to make better decisions in the future.